You ever notice how the world has this strange habit of underestimating the wrong person? It always starts the same way. A look, a whisper, a judgment made before a single word is spoken. And that's exactly how this story begins. Meet Anthony Cole, a black man, a self-made CEO, a figure who carried the kind of quiet authority you don't need to brag about. He wasn't the type to walk into a room and shout, "Look at me!" No, Anthony was the man who walked in, and suddenly everyone else lowered their voices without knowing why. The kind of presence that said, "I've been through fire before, and I came out stronger." But if you had seen him on this particular morning, standing at gate C-17 of Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, you might have mistaken him for just another business traveler. Navy blue suit, crisp white shirt, leather briefcase tucked in his left hand, worn smooth from years of use. Calm eyes that had seen boardrooms in Dubai, London, Shanghai, and still found comfort in a simple black coffee before a flight. Anthony didn't need to flex his wealth. He didn't need to post his life online. Because when you really have power, you don't chase validation. You move in silence. And yet silence is exactly what got broken that morning. As passengers boarded, first class filled quickly. Anthony handed over his ticket, nodded politely to the attendant, and found his seat by the window. Routine. Comfortable. Nothing unusual. Until it was. Because not everyone was comfortable. From just a row back, a man stared. White. Mid-50s, the type who wore entitlement like cologne, loud, heavy, suffocating. He leaned forward, whispered to the flight attendant, glancing at Anthony with a sharp, dismissive look. And Anthony had seen that look before. It was the same look bankers gave him when he walked in for his first loan decades ago. The same look investors gave him before his first company hit 8 figures. The same look that never said you don't belong, but screamed it all the same. And within minutes, here came the tap on Anthony's shoulder. "Sir, we're going to need you to move." Anthony blinked. Calm, polite. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "To another seat," the attendant clarified, her voice wrapped in a customer service smile, but her eyes avoiding his. And Anthony tilted his head, confused. "Not available. My ticket says otherwise." And then came the truth. "Sir, another passenger isn't comfortable with you sitting here." Let that sink in. Not late booking, not technical error, not airline mistake. No, the issue was Anthony himself. He hadn't spoken a word. Hadn't broken a rule, hadn't so much as unfolded his newspaper. But his presence was enough to make someone uncomfortable. And the airline's response? Not to protect their paying customer, not to stand on principle, but to bend. To move Anthony like furniture, as if his dignity had less value than a complaint. Now, most people would have argued, raised their voice, said, "No, I paid for this, I belong here." But Anthony? He didn't flinch, didn't fight, didn't give them the satisfaction of a scene. Instead, he smiled, just barely, a half smile only he understood. And in silence, he picked up his briefcase, rose to his feet, and walked to another seat. The attendant exhaled in relief. The white passenger smirked, leaning back like he'd won something. The cabin settled back into its quiet hum. But Anthony wasn't defeated, not even close. Because here's what they didn't know. The man they had just humiliated was the same man reviewing their airline's $120 million budget contract. That single account, signed or frozen, would decide whether this airline stayed profitable this quarter, whether their expansion went through, whether bonuses were paid. And all it would take was one call, one instruction, one signature. The kind of power no one in that cabin could see. Not the smug passenger, not the flight attendant, not even the captain behind the locked cockpit door. Anthony knew, and that was enough. So while the plane taxied down the runway, while passengers buckled their belts and sipped their waters, Anthony stared out the window, calm, silent, patient. Because when you carry real power, you don't fight in aisles, you fight in boardrooms. And when you strike so hard, people never forget your name. What Anthony didn't know yet was that this flight wasn't done testing him. Because humiliation has a way of snowballing, and before this journey was over, the airline would make mistake after mistake, each one digging their own grave deeper. And Anthony be waiting at the top with the shovel.
The hum of the engines grew louder as the plane lifted into the sky. For most passengers, it was just another flight. But for Anthony, every second was a reminder. Not of the insult itself, he'd lived through worse, but of the casual ease with which it had all unfolded. How simple it had been for them. A whisper, a tap on the shoulder, a polite request to move. And just like that, decades of success, respect, and earned privilege had been erased in the eyes of a stranger. That was what lingered. Anthony sat back, his fingers tapping lightly against the leather of his briefcase. He didn't open his laptop, didn't pull out the stack of documents he usually reviewed mid-flight. No. He just sat, watching, listening. Because when you've been underestimated your whole life, you learn something powerful. Silence is often the loudest weapon in the room. The flight attendant passed by, pouring drinks, her eyes flicking toward him with that nervous guilt people wear when they know they've done wrong but aren't brave enough to admit it. She gave him a half-smile, the kind meant to patch things over, without actually apologizing. Anthony didn't return it. He didn't need to. Instead, he observed. The white passenger, the man who'd claimed Anthony's rightful seat, was comfortable now, reclined, drink in hand, chatting up the attendants as if he owned the cabin. He laughed loud, the kind of laugh that demanded attention, the kind that said, "Look at me, I belong here more than anyone else." It was arrogance, pure and simple, and the airline had fed it. But arrogance blinds people. It blinds them to the storm quietly brewing just out of sight. Halfway through the flight, turbulence shook the cabin. Drinks rattled, passengers gasped. Anthony barely moved. A man who'd faced boardroom wars, federal investigations, and multi-million-dollar takeovers didn't flinch at a few bumps in the sky. But turbulence has a funny way of peeling masks. The confident white passenger, he panicked. His face went pale, his hands gripping the armrest tight, as if the earth itself were falling away. Suddenly, he wasn't laughing anymore. Suddenly, he wasn't the loudest man in the room. Anthony noticed, and he smiled. Not cruelly, not mockingly, but knowingly. Because life has a way of leveling people out. 1 minute you're on top, the next you're just another passenger praying the plane lands safely. And in that moment, Anthony realized something. This entire situation wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about one insult or one seat. It was about power. who wields it, who abuses it, and who truly controls the game. As the turbulence passed and calm returned, the attendant came back with an apology hidden behind service etiquette. "Would you like something to drink, sir?" Anthony looked at her for the first time since the incident, his eyes calm, steady. "I dissented," he said softly. She nodded, hurried, almost grateful he hadn't lashed out. But inside, Anthony was already making calculations. He knew this airline inside and out, their contracts, their budgets, their weak spots. And he knew one truth better than anyone. Airlines don't run on planes. They run on money. And he held the lever to that money. By the time the plane descended toward New York, Anthony had already decided this wasn't going to end here, because sometimes silence isn't surrender. Sometimes silence is strategy. As passengers gathered their bags and shuffled out, the white man shot Anthony one last look, half smug, half nervous, as though he sensed there was more beneath the surface than he'd realized. Anthony didn't look back. He didn't need to, because he knew something that man would soon learn the hard way. When you humiliate someone who doesn't need to prove their power, you set the stage for your own downfall. And as Anthony stepped off the plane into the terminal, the chessboard was already set.
New York greeted him with its usual chaos. Horns blaring, people rushing, screens flashing 100 headlines at once. But Anthony walked through it with the same steady calm he carried off the plane. He wasn't thinking about the insult anymore. He was thinking about the opportunity. Because in Anthony's world, every act of disrespect was a business lesson. Every slight, a negotiation. Every humiliation, a potential investment. And the airline had just invested in the wrong man's silence. He arrived at his office, a tower of glass that seemed to slice into the clouds. The kind of building that didn't just say success, it screamed it. Employees straightened the moment he walked in. Assistants hurried to keep up. And yet Anthony barely acknowledged any of it. He had bigger things on his mind. Inside his private office, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city like a chessboard waiting to be played. He dropped his briefcase on the desk, sat down, and finally opened his laptop. Not to catch up on work, but to pull up a file that most people didn't even know existed. The airline's budget report. Yes, that airline. The same one that thought a black man in first class was disposable. The same one that thought Anthony Ridley was just another passenger. What they didn't realize was that his company controlled a major contract supplying jet fuel to multiple airlines, including theirs. A contract worth more than $120 million a year. And with one phone call, one signed document, Anthony could freeze that budget. Not as revenge, not out of spite, but on principle. Because if a company wanted to treat its highest-paying customers with arrogance, then maybe it needed to feel what arrogance cost. Anthony leaned back in his chair, fingertips pressed together, letting the numbers glow across his screen. He thought about the shareholders, the executives, the board meetings that would erupt if the budget suddenly stalled. Panic would spread like wildfire. Stocks would tumble. And all because one flight attendant, one manager, one system believed he was invisible. But Anthony wasn't invisible. He was the storm they never saw coming. The phone on his desk rang. His assistant's voice came through, polite but anxious. "Mr. Ridley, the airline's executive liaison is on line 1. They said it's urgent."
Anthony smiled. He hadn't even moved yet. They were already nervous. He picked up the receiver, slowly, deliberately. "This is Ridley." "Mr. Ridley, I hope your flight was comfortable." There it was, the hesitation, the careful tone of someone who knew. Word travels fast in industries where reputations matter more than profit. Anthony didn't answer the question. Instead, he let silence do the work. Seconds ticked. The man on the other end fumbled, cleared his throat. We're aware there may have been a misunderstanding, and we'd like to assure you that the airline takes these matters very seriously." Anthony finally spoke, his voice low, measured. "Do you know what the difference is between a misunderstanding and a mistake?" The line went quiet. "A misunderstanding happens when people don't know better. A mistake happens when they do. Which do you think this was?" The liaison stuttered something about company policy, passenger safety, procedures, excuses dressed up as professionalism. Anthony let him talk. He always let people talk, because the more they spoke, the more they revealed. And when the man finally ran out of words, Anthony gave his reply. "Here's what's going to happen. I'll be sending over a proposal. You'll forward it directly to your board. No detours, no delays. And in the meantime, don't call me again. I'll call you." He hung up, calmly. No raised voice, no threats. Because true power doesn't need volume. It only needs precision. And in that moment, Anthony Ridley wasn't just a passenger who'd been disrespected. He was the man holding the fate of a $120 million budget in his hands. The airline thought the flight had ended when the wheels touched down. But for Anthony, the real flight, the one that would shake the ground beneath them, was just taking off.
The next morning, the headlines were already buzzing. Not about Anthony, not yet, but about the airline. A sudden rumor in the financial circuits, whispers of instability, shareholders asking questions they weren't supposed to ask this early in the quarter. Anthony hadn't made a move, not officially, but in his world, silence was louder than any press release. When a man like him doesn't react, people panic. His legal team was already drafting the paperwork. His financial analysts were modeling scenarios, and every scenario ended with one conclusion. The airline would feel it, deep. But Anthony wasn't just looking to punish. No, that would have been too easy, too predictable. He wanted them to learn. He wanted them to stand in a boardroom, staring at a balance sheet that didn't make sense, and realize this didn't happen because of a competitor. This didn't happen because of the market. This happened because they disrespected the wrong man. Meanwhile, across the country, the airline's leadership scrambled. Meetings were called at odd hours. Lawyers whispered in corners. Emails piled up with one word in every subject line: urgent. The CEO herself, white-haired, sharp-suited, with a smile polished by decades of boardroom victories, was now asking a question she never expected to ask. Who exactly is Anthony Ridley? The answer came with a weight that made the room fall silent. He wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He wasn't just a CEO. He was the man behind one of the most influential energy suppliers in North America. The man who controlled contracts that kept airlines in the sky. And now, he controlled theirs. The CEO sat back, her carefully composed face cracking for the first time in years. Find him, set a meeting, now.
But Anthony wasn't interested in meetings. He wasn't interested in their rehearsed apologies or their half-hearted promises, because for him, this was never about words. It was about principle. At his office, Anthony reviewed the final document, a single page, a single signature line. It wasn't dramatic, no bold fonts, no fiery threats, just a calm, surgical decision, suspension of service until further notice. One stroke of his pen and the airline's lifeline would dry up. But Anthony didn't sign, not yet. He wanted them to sweat. Instead, he called his head of strategy. "I want alternatives drawn up for every one of their competitors, every single one. Let them know Ridley Energy is ready to talk." It was a masterstroke. He wasn't just threatening to cut them off. He was opening doors for everyone else to take their place. By the end of the day, rival airlines would be circling like vultures. Deals would be drafted, opportunities whispered, and the very company that threw him out of first class would be watching their competition grow stronger. Anthony leaned back. Not smug, not gloating, just steady. Because this wasn't revenge. This was balance. He thought back to that moment on the plane, the smirk, the whispers, the arrogance dripping from every so-called professional who thought they could shove him aside. And he realized something. They thought they were protecting first class, but they didn't understand what first class really meant. First class wasn't a seat. It wasn't champagne in a glass or a slightly wider cushion. First class was power, the kind of power that didn't need validation, the kind of power that walked off a plane quietly and still left the entire industry shaking. Anthony closed the file on his desk. Outside his window, the city glittered, unaware of the storm brewing behind closed doors. But inside boardrooms hundreds of miles away, panic was spreading. Executives who once laughed at small complaints were now begging for answers. Lawyers drafted statements, public relations firms tested language, and through it all, one truth lingered in the air. They underestimated the wrong man. Because Anthony wasn't fighting for a seat on a plane. He was teaching a lesson in respect, one that came with a $120 million price tag. And as the hours ticked by, the airline realized something far more terrifying than lost revenue. They hadn't just insulted a passenger. They had awakened a force they couldn't control. By the time the sun rose over Wall Street, the airline's troubles were no longer whispers. They were headlines. Energy supplier pulls back from major carrier. Airline faces supply chain freeze. And the one headline that made Anthony smirk ever so slightly, $120 million question. What went wrong? What went wrong? He could have told them in 3 words. Disrespect has consequences. But inside their glass-walled headquarters, executives weren't smiling. The mood was chaos, pure, unfiltered panic. Conference calls bled into emergency meetings. Phones buzzed nonstop. Stock prices wobbled like a ship in a storm. One executive slammed his hand against the polished mahogany table. "We need a statement, something reassuring." Another snapped back. "We don't need a statement, we need fuel. Without Ridley, we can't even guarantee next month's routes." The CEO, once composed, was now pacing the length of the boardroom. Her calm, calculated air was gone, replaced by something unfamiliar. Desperation. Because Anthony hadn't even announced anything officially. That was the beauty of it. He didn't need to. His silence was enough to send their investors scrambling. In business, perception was reality, and right now, the perception was simple. Their lifeline was at risk, and Anthony Ridley held the scissors. Across the street, financial analysts broadcast updates with the urgency usually reserved for natural disasters. Shareholders called, demanding answers. Customers began asking whether flights would be canceled. Even pilots whispered nervously in lounges. And all Anthony did was wait. Because patience to a man like him was another form of pressure. The longer he stayed quiet, the more their fear grew. Meanwhile, in his office, Anthony's team presented him with updates. Competitors had already reached out, hungry, eager to take advantage of the airline's weakness. Some offered lucrative deals. Others simply wanted to be in Anthony's good graces. He listened, nodded, but made no commitments. He wasn't rushing. This wasn't about quick profit. This was about leverage, and leverage required timing. Back at the airline, the CEO finally ordered what she never thought she would: damage control with a man they once treated like an inconvenience. Her assistant dialed. Emails flew. Middlemen begged for meetings. Messages were left on phones that Anthony didn't bother to check, because Anthony wasn't available. Not to them. Not yet. Instead, he was at dinner with his daughter, listening to her talk about her college projects. No business talk, no drama. Just family. And that's what made him dangerous. Because while they were burning the midnight oil, drowning in anxiety, Anthony was calm. He didn't live in their chaos. They lived in his. The airline tried everything. They called lawyers, lobbyists, even government officials to apply pressure. But here's the truth. Power respects power. And Anthony's influence stretched too far, too deep for anyone to push him. Their $120 million budget freeze wasn't just a number anymore. It was an open wound, and every tick of the clock drove the knife deeper. Inside the boardroom, someone finally cracked. "We should have just let him sit in the damn seat," one executive muttered under his breath. The room went quiet, because they all knew he was right. A single act of arrogance had spiraled into a corporate nightmare. And Anthony? He wasn't even raising his voice. He didn't need to. His power was in his restraint. His silence was louder than their frantic scrambling. The CEO finally sat down, shoulders heavy. "We underestimated him," she admitted. The words tasted bitter, but truth often does. And still, no one could answer the question echoing across the industry. What does Anthony Ridley want? Because until he gave that answer, they were at his mercy.
The calls didn't stop. The emails didn't slow down. Every hour that passed was another nail in the airline's coffin. And Anthony? He still hadn't spoken a word. Until the 6th day. That morning, his secretary walked in with a stack of messages. "They're begging for a meeting again," she said, almost amused. Anthony looked up from his desk, calm as ever. He didn't ask who. He didn't need to. He simply nodded and said, "I'll see them. One meeting. My terms." By noon, the airline's top executives were seated in his private conference room, an elegant space overlooking the New York skyline. They shuffled papers, whispered nervously, avoided eye contact like school children about to be scolded. And then the door opened. Anthony walked in, not hurried, not grandiose, just steady. His presence alone silenced the room. He didn't carry binders or documents. He didn't need them.
The power dynamic was already set. They were in his house now. "Mr. Ridley," the CEO began carefully, her voice tight, "we want to apologize for what—" Anthony raised a hand, not angrily, not dismissively, just enough to make her stop. "Save the apologies," he said quietly. His voice was calm, almost soft, but it cut sharper than any outburst could. The room froze. Anthony leaned forward, resting his hands on the table. "You didn't just move me from a seat. You reminded me of something. That no matter how much a man achieves, some people will always try to shrink him down, to remind him of a place they think he belongs. And that's fine." He paused. Let the silence stretch. Let them squirm. "Because when you try to box me in," he said slowly, "I don't fight for a seat on your plane. I buy the sky you're flying in." The line hit like a thunderclap. Executives shifted uncomfortably, realizing they weren't negotiating with a man. They were negotiating with the storm he controlled. Finally, the CEO found her voice. "What do you want?" Anthony's eyes narrowed. Not in anger, in precision. "I want 3 things. 1. Formal acknowledgement of what happened. Not just to me, but to every passenger you disrespected. Public, transparent. 2. A seat, not on your plane, but on your board. I don't sit in the back when decisions are made about how people are treated. And 3, he let the words hang in the air, each syllable deliberate. You're going to fund a scholarship program for young black men and women in aviation, pilots, engineers, executives. A pipeline of leadership. Because if the future is going to fly, it better not look like your past." The room went dead silent. No one dared to speak, no one dared to argue, because they all knew they had no leverage, no power, no choice. Anthony straightened his jacket. He said, "Do this, and maybe you'll get your $120 million budget unfrozen." The CEO swallowed hard, nodded once. It wasn't a negotiation. It was surrender. And just like that, the storm was over. Days later, headlines exploded again, but this time the story was different. Airline partners with Black CEO on diversity initiative. Historic scholarship fund announced. Anthony Ridley joins board. The airline painted it as progress, as vision, as leadership. But the people who knew the truth knew better. This wasn't their victory. This was Anthony's. And Anthony? He didn't brag. He didn't gloat. He didn't sit for interviews or sit for press tours. Instead, he quietly signed the paperwork, froze and unfroze millions like it was nothing. And then he went home and kissed his daughter goodnight and sat on the porch of the house he had built with his own hands. Because power isn't loud. Power isn't showy. Power doesn't need applause. Real power is the ability to walk into a storm and leave with the sky in your hands. And that's exactly what Anthony Ridley had done.